Ya está tu nombre. Pero entonces no le iban a dar, ¿no? Ahorita no van a poner. Ya están todos. Ok.
Muy buenos días. Estamos por iniciar las labores del segundo día del quinto foro. Les agradeceríamos tomaran sus lugares. Gracias.
Buenos días. Buenos días tengan todos ustedes. Vamos a dar inicio a este segundo día del quinto foro de la democracia latinoamericana, que es organizado conjuntamente por la Organización de los Estados Americanos, el Tribunal Electoral del Poder Judicial de la Federación, el Colegio de México, el Instituto Nacional Electoral, Fondo de Cultura Económica e Idea Internacional. Nos corresponde uno de nuestras 3 conferencias magistrales. Esta misma va a ser moderada y comentada por Federico Reyes Heroles, quien es un escritor mexicano. Él es presidente y fundador de la revista Este País. Por favor, Federico, tienes la palabra.
Muy buenos días. Bueno, antes que nada quisiera yo felicitar a los organizadores porque esta se está convirtiendo en una muy buena tradición, que una vez al año nos sentemos a confrontar cómo está el estado de la democracia, en este caso también de la ciudadanía, en nuestra área latinoamericana, que compartamos en este tipo de espacios breves, sin demasiado espectáculo, lo que estamos viendo para bien y para mal. Y eso nos puede ayudar a aprender de experiencias exitosas y también a prevenirnos de asuntos que pueden ser, diría yo, no deseables. Es para mí un honor estar aquí con la presidenta Chinchilla. Quiero decirlo, es un personaje en muchos sentidos. Es un personaje por su experiencia, larga experiencia en el área de seguridad, y no la vamos a dejar que se vaya sin que nos hable un poco de seguridad. Pero también es un personaje, ustedes saben, la primera presidenta de Costa Rica, y es un personaje porque ha sabido lidiar con la modernidad en un país que tiene muchísimos rasgos de los cuales podemos aprender. Costa Rica es un país pequeño en territorio, con poca población comparada con México. Estamos hablando de 5 millones, quizá en Iztapalapa, menos, ¿verdad? Menos, no llega a los 5 millones, creo que en Iztapalapa hay como 5 más o menos. Entonces, y sin embargo, es un pequeño gran país. ¿Por qué es un pequeño gran país? Bueno, todos sabemos que en Costa Rica se abolió el ejército en 1948, después de una experiencia bastante traumática, por decirlo de alguna manera, y que a partir de entonces ha habido una organización republicana realmente admirable. El abolengo de la democracia costarricense es algo que nos sigue admirando, y cómo se resuelven todas las diferencias a través del aparato democrático. No exento de problemas, pero hay otros puntos. Miren, una de las características que apuntan los indicadores internacionales es que es campeón en igualdad de género en todo el continente. Y esto, para México, caray, es todavía una meta muy lejana. Se lleva el lugar número 1 en todo el continente en lo que se refiere a participación de la mujer en las distintas actividades políticas. Después yo diría, nuestro gran lastre apuntado
to what is a public career. And this is more or less what I wanted to bring here. I want to tell you which are some of the concerns, from the perspective of those who have been pretty close to the evolution of institutions in our region. The first thing that we need to recognize, and here we have experts, and these are the elements that have been analyzed here and in other forums. What we have to recognize undoubtedly is that political Latin American systems have seen important progress in recent years from the perspective of the strengthening of
Si tan solo analizamos qué pasaba por allá en mitad de los años 70, hablábamos
the 70s, we were speaking about 3 or 4 countries, and in our region, those through open electoral systems and competitive systems, and today it is the rule. It is the rule in Latin America. And if we also see the indicators that will grade the quality of democracies from the electoral perspective, we see the important evolution, and it has gone from 0.28 in a to an indicator that is close to 1. And we have not only seen great cleaning and protection of democracy, but we have other manifestations that also
de lo que ha venido pasando, como ha sido el papel, por ejemplo, de las fuerzas del orden, las fuerzas armadas, las fuerzas policiales, mucho más replegadas a los temas que, desde un punto de vista de una democracia constitucional, se les confiere con el único riesgo, y si podemos entrar en la segunda parte de esta exposición al tema de la
year 2004, when the first global study was done about democracy in Latin America, financed by the United Nations. 50%. Were the characteristics of the people who liked democracy, and at that time we saw ambivalent groups. And if we make progress, we then years and happy with the performance of democracy. And then we saw the grades given by European citizens to their democracy. And those are years of good performance. Time of growth. So in pretty positive conditions and economically growing and bringing more development to populate, bringing people out of poverty and with more participation spaces, Latin American citizens are not happy with their democracy, as Europeans felt in the last 3 or 4 years. So one warning was a study by the to speak despite of the concerns of citizens in light of their democracies. It was not possible to speak about some uncomfortable situation with democracy, but yes, there was some uncomfortable democracy, and I believe the challenge we have towards the future is to prevent that uncomfortability in the to become an uncomfortable situation or discomfort with democracy, and attention to some of the trends that we observe. Unavoidably, we're going to have this setting of discomfort with democracy, and from there on, the scenario is going to become much more complex and sensitive. And also see that towards the future, in these days, we have announced economic growth scenarios, and we can see there are going to be difficult years. This time that we less employment, less people coming out of poverty, and consequently much more discomfort with the performance of the political system. But we also come to a point where precisely the success obtained taking people out of poverty and making a more robust middle class, this is for the political system that we are going to have, and we are living this, we're going to have aspirations, growing aspirations, because this is exactly what this is all about. Middle class societies. In other words, we want to have citizens with aspirations. We don't want them to be happy with only having access to services such as education and public transportation or health services. They also want those services to be good quality services. So we have found a scenario in light of the limited economic conditions that implies big challenges. And in development, we're going to find growing demands by these groups that came to make the middle class, Latin American middle class, bigger. And we're going to find new political players, how they are going to become first line players in the political Latin American agendas, like in the case of women. But we also have indigenous populations and other minorities, and they are going to have their agenda of demands. We will also have, and we're going to have much more empowered civil society with much more access to information thanks to digital technologies and with more possibility to have their voice the tools that we have in the social media. And at the same time, we're going to have states that will also take into consideration the global construction, not only because of the impact of the global agenda in national circumstances, but also because there are many decisions that have to do with the commitment that we have made according to our participation in the international system. And basically, what we would configure a great experience in the perspective of aware, educated, and more empowered citizenship with scenarios where the resources will not come as a citizen's need. And in light of this scenario, how do I see? What do I see the evolution? How do I see the evolution of democracy, of Latin American democracy? I basically see it like this. I see how it faces at least a situation where we see it faces a decision, a choice. And whatever the choice is going to be, it will not be what is the most convenient choice for the Latin American society. So the biggest challenge is to try to come to this pathway that allow us to respond and to the development agenda, the demands, to the social demands, always preserving and always protecting these basic standards and fundamental standards of and we have the risk of autocracia, and this is autocracy is the constant, the attestment politologists have said in the past.
De legitimación democrática no es de por sí razón suficiente y hemos venido viendo en algunas de las naciones de la América Latina es que
Are democracies. There are democracies where there is an electoral democracy, but we couldn't necessarily say that the process is a complete process, because precisely through a vote or electoral democracy, it's been possible to legitimate government systems, autocratic government systems, which are with power concentration and the power in one individual, with a sensitive and important lack of effective control over the political power and cancellation of rule of law and important restrictions from the perspective of the exercise of some civilian freedoms. This is one of the risks Latin American democracy is exposed to. And another risk is the risk of vitocracia. This is a term that I took from a politologist, and I know and it is a controversial fact, and it comes from the analysis of the North American political system Francis Fukuyama. He says how the U.S. or the North American political system, and there are several cases of Latin American nations and countries that seem to be running and taking the same pathway, but they are suffering hypertrophy in the democratic apparatus and mechanisms, according to which the enactment of reforms that we have promoted in recent years, democratic systems, instead of always guaranteeing the fundamental constitutional principle of the liberal
de poderes, los pesos y los contrapesos, lo que hemos terminado es prácticamente ser nacional en una profundo para poder dar respuestas a las necesidades ciudadanas con la oportunidad y con la calidad de decisiones con que los ciudadanos la están demandando. Algunos de los ejemplos que yo podría, digamos, en este momento enarbolar serían, por ejemplo, enormes rigideces institucionales que no nos permiten en algunas naciones ni siquiera hacer que un instrumento tan importante para el ejercicio del poder político, desde el Poder Ejecutivo, desde el ejercicio de la presidencia, como es el presupuesto nacional, pueda aprobarse con oportunidad o en el marco de las condiciones de la propuesta que el Poder Ejecutivo está esperando, digamos, impulsar. Vemos cómo se suceden la usurpación y los conflictos entre los poderes del Estado, el Poder Ejecutivo, el Judicial, el Legislativo. Vemos cómo cada vez más agarran fuerza tendencias hacia la judicialización de las decisiones políticas, y no hablo solamente de cómo se ventilan algunas de las disputas políticas a través de la justicia penal, hablo de que prácticamente encontramos puntos de impugnación y incentivos al veto por parte de minorías, por parte de quienes no comparten una decisión del Poder Ejecutivo, gracias a los diferentes mecanismos que hemos diseñado para que esas decisiones administrativas se puedan impugnar por la vía judicial. De manera que tenemos en consecuencia ahí un riesgo muy elevado, lo cual de alguna manera nos lleva
it will take us to one of the warnings, in the report that I already spoke about, the United Nations 2004 report, and it is something we still see. When Latin American citizens were asked if they were to choose between development and democracy, most of them said that they wanted to have development. So despite of the fact that and the democracies that have acceptable, relatively acceptable standards, if we're going to be speaking about constitutional and liberal democracy, even in those democracies, how we have tied the exercise of the work of the president through this design of institutional reforms and the hypertrophy that we have created, where it is going to be the citizenship, where the ones speaking about the importance of democracy in relative terms in order to have positive results, and of course to stimulate, to promote trends toward more autocratic systems. To end, I would like to point out I do believe that there is an important agreement, and that sets forth that democracy, with all its imperfections, is something that we and strive for. It is difficult for people to question it. or to express questions about democracy. But yes, there is a need. There is an important need to guide, to have a debate. And according to this debate, we would love to analyze carefully the reforms required by the Latin American political systems. And we should also undoubtedly help to strengthen citizenship. So it is going to be a more informed, better informed citizenship with a larger quota, with a higher, not empowerment from the perspective of rights, but we should also speak about the perspective of public responsibilities, because this is one of the biggest deficits of citizenships in some Latin American societies. And so we want to, and I would like to rephrase one of the conclusions of Fresa Caria in relationship to one of the publications about the topic of freedom. We want to not only be concerned about the need to generate Latin America with enough conditions to come to democracy. This was the biggest challenge 20 or 30 years ago. But at this point in time, we want to start thinking and asking and wondering which are the security conditions that our democracy needs in order to keep on guaranteeing future development of Latin America. Thank you very much. We have many questions, and some of them are very interesting questions. So I would like to simply to give the floor over to our people. Something that calls the attention about Costa Rica is this slow and systematic construction of citizenship. There are two great texts, I would say, of how in Latin America we first came to constitutions and then to citizenships. Unlike the United States and unlike Europe, when Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States, what called his attention is how citizens are intertwined and how they combat jointly in an organized manner. And I am making reference to the book by Rafael Rojas, which is The Republics of Air, and the one by Fernando Escalante, which is Imaginary Citizens. And he is a member of this Colegio de Mexico. And both are a comparison of how in Mexico, and not only in Mexico, but in Latin America, how we build republics from top to bottom. And this is also related to the origin of the word citizens. It comes from cities. The migration is an important factor. And believing there is going to be citizenship in very little communities, it is going to be difficult, because Mexico has 100,000 communities with less than 1,000 people, and many of those places are getting empty. So there is a social and demographic correlationship. And something that caught my attention about your presentation is this tension, and there are several questions on this. The traditional way of participation and the new ways of participation. Some years ago, I went to a philanthropy meeting in Argentina, and there was a philanthropist who said, we are going towards the organization without organizations, and he was making reference to the social media with all its pros and cons. These are movements that come from a horizontal impact, but then they just disappear. So what is going to be the balance? Because we also need to have permanent institutions that will have a document. And this is something we are here in Mexico. We live here in Mexico every day. I will give you this information. In a survey that we did shortly ago, we asked citizens how many citizens belong to unions and how many belong and participated to political parties, and the result was 2% membership, people with a membership, and we have 45 million Facebook accounts. 45 million Facebook accounts. And there is an anecdote, and that happened to Carlos Navarrete, the chairman, when he was the leader at the Senate upper chamber, and he is now the representative, the national coordinator of a political party. And once he was told, this is not working well because in the social media there are some terrible movements, and he said, no, let's pass the tax. And another person who was working with the social media told him, come and look at these numbers. And 2 weeks after, he told him, look, Senator, if we pass this law, we're going to have the biggest demonstration against the Senate that we've seen in the country. So there are new ways of participation. And by the way, that tax was not accepted. So there are new and interesting ways of participation. So I tried to make my work, and I tried to group the questions, and I tried to keep like an alphabetical order. No, it is not an alphabetical order. I wanted to group them by the topic, and I will not have the time to read all the questions, but there is one by Alejandro Porras from UNAM, from INE. There is another one from Carmen Delgado from the College of Public Administration, another one by Angel Herrera, and there is another question, but it is dwelling on the same topic, and this is how you manage to have greater participation of women in your country, and what would you suggest apart from this modification that has been made to the electoral law for women participation. What else could we learn in Mexico in order to give an incentive and to promote women participation? Obviously, there is always the temptation to comment on what the commentator is commenting to you, but it is not. I would love to have a coffee with Federico, but it is a time to answer your questions. Let's say the following. Women. Of course, it is easier to speak about promotion, social inclusion processes from the political inclusion perspective when societies are homogeneous. And I always think the recognition of evolution, of institutional evolution that we have had in Costa Rica. And obviously this is related to people, men and women, visionaries who in history knew how to shelter, they knew how to make important decisions. And they were strengthening our democracy. But there is also an origin in all this. And this is why it is normal to see the flow of decisions. And Costa Rica, for example, Costa Rica never lived the levels of stratification that were the early characteristics since the time of the colonia, the characteristic of many societies. So more equality, economic equality and political equality. In terms of the race, it is a society, a pretty well integrated society. We do not have many indigenous people. There is a low percentage of Afro people. Obviously, they face big challenges to exercise their rights, but since they have a low participation, it is not a dramatic situation. As dramatic as the efforts we see in other Latin American countries. So the participation of women in similar conditions, relatively similar conditions, it's been a process that has flown in normal terms. And in Costa Rica, women have voted for only 60 years, and then years went by to have one female runner or candidate. But since that time, we've seen this pretty systematic work that has allowed more and more women to participate. It was vital to see the organization of women. It was vital to see the movement promoted by female organizations. It was vital to see some of the first women doing this change, because we do not, there is no consistency when there are groups who are aware of their groups. And we were able to obtain that. There is no doubt that without special legislations and affirmative lessons, and even the very controversial and discussed quotas, I believe it would have been difficult to attain the levels of participation we have been able to attain. But, as I said, in relationship to democracy, there are no consolidated scenarios either. After getting almost 40% of the women participation, almost 40% of women participation in the parliament, during my administration, during my term, but in these elections that we just had, the percentage went down to almost 30%. Why? Democracy is alive. Democracy is alive, and we will not have very stiff rules. And it is the anguish and the anxiety that we have suffered. And for those who exercise the political rights, we want to take the politics within the limits, and we will not necessarily express the social and the political dynamics. And in Costa Rica, for example, one of the phenomena that affects levels of governance is presidentialism. That is a stiff with a diverse, with multi-political parties. So in the last election, despite of the norms and the standards, female participation for Congress, multi-political parties headed by male. This is why there was a dispersed vote, and the alternates. It was not enough to preserve levels of participation of women. But I would say those three elements are fundamental. The political sociology that we have in Costa Rica, together with fights of the women collective groups, and the set of laws that came to reinforce and to make it possible to make changes, the changes we were pursuing. There are two questions on the crisis of the political parties and how you channel this, and one of them by José Trinidad, and another question comes from Salvador. What is being done for the participation of young people specifically? Are there actions to promote young people participation? And it could be a very serious effect. I don't think Costa Rica is the best example of what is happening at the level of the political parties. And I know there is always a risk when speaking about this, to talk to nationals about the things that you do not see positive, because nationals, we are pretty rigorous with what happens to our country, to our nation. But if we analyze our political Latin American tradition, where another big concern is the debate oriented, and in light of the frustration and levels, we see how the Latin American presidentialist systems, how all the issues are getting resolved. There are some people promoting the introduction of parliamentary systems in our countries. And of course, when each time there is a parliamentary system, a lot of people think in terms of England, but only a few people will think in terms of Italy. And I believe it is going to be the Italian model, the one that will prevail in Latin America, much more than the British model. And I am saying this because presidentialism is a good system. I still believe that part of the Latin American political culture is that this is a good system, but some requirements should be met. And the reforms that we have generated are taking us away from those ideal conditions, and we are taking this presidentialism to the worst scenario, which is a political culture that is still asking from the president, and since the president has the powers to make and to decide, but it is a system that is tied in the hands of all presidents, and they are not allowed to make decisions. So there are many big expectations, but at the end of the day we have minimum achievements. One of the important topics is the political party system. Strong political parties, we want them to become an element of the negotiation process with the executive branch and capable of challenging the demands. Mexico has 3 political parties, and for a presidentialistic system, to me this would be the ideal situation, to have 3 political parties with very good structures, strong internal discipline, political parties with some doctrine principles, and the center left, center right, and center, or however you want to call it. And what we've seen in Costa Rica and in many other Latin American countries is a weakening of the traditional political parties. We have also seen an explosion of multi-partidism that is not obeying to the doctrine currents in light of the frustration of the civil society with those political parties which are not. Dialogue means with the power they become almost NGOs and non-governmental organizations, and today in Parliament we have our political party of evangelists. So there is no state vision, there is rather a corporate vision that will then come to the executive branch. And I am very honest because I don't think Costa Rica is an example to follow. I believe it is Mexico. Mexico is the one that is starting to tell us what to do, which are the things that we need to restate and to come back to in order to have an operational political party system if we want to keep on protecting the presidentialism in terms of participation of young people. At this point in time, the Costa Rica politics is being criticized. It is being seen with some anger, but it is interesting because it is precisely from the youngest people from where there seems to be more hopeful groups, and sometimes we see how they criticize. They also ask, but we see some of them. I studied digital technologies, and I love this topic, and I love the social media, and I still believe, even if it is uncomfortable for us, we need to work with the spaces such as the social media, and we have to learn how important they are. They are not the point of reference, and they should not tie our hands. But I do believe internet is a hope. It is not a threat for the future of humankind. And I believe the reflection we can admit in terms of the operation of the social media, without speaking about minor and electronic crimes, the only control mechanism is going to be the one that comes from the culture, from this culture that will be teaching people how to discriminate content and how to manage the social media. Costa Rica, after an explosion that we lived in my government, we started to see a better consistency between social media management in a more reasonable dimension, and this is stimulating activism in young people, because young people are the ones using social media, from my perspective, in a more responsible manner. They can discriminate, they can tell what is gossip, which are the deeper virtual fora and thinking. And the virtual fora is an element that is allowing young people to participate in politics. Very good. There are 3 critical questions. There are 3 critical questions about Costa Rica. The first one is by Juan R. Marin, where he criticizes Electoral results are not reliable, and misery is almost 50% of the population, and a very high crime rate. Another one by Carlos Rosales. He asks, why is it that crime is growing this much in Costa Rica? And then there is another criticism by Manuel Antonio Ramirez Pacheco. He speaks about discrimination towards color-skinned people in Costa Rica. Well, let's see. Let's start with the last comment. I do not know exactly. Right? I do not know exactly which are some of the parameters that would allow me to make a more comparative analysis of what is, or in terms of discrimination. The discrimination some groups are subject to, some of our minority groups in our population. So I would not necessarily say that this is one of the countries where there is more or less discrimination. We could be within the mean, we can be within the mean, the average in some of our regional countries. But yes, it is true that the Afro and indigenous minorities, when they talk to you, and sometimes they say this, which is right. They are right. They are very proportionally small groups in our population that it's been more difficult for them. It's been more difficult for them to get to see their problems. The fact of being little people, that visibility is much more difficult. It is a constant job, and at least Costa Rica has signed all the international agreements on this topic. And of course, despite of the progress made, we have the obligation to keep on working. In our administration, in my term, we gave importance and we gave weight to guarantee what I have always believed is the arrowhead of all social transformation, which is access to education for indigenous people. This has been, and this was the fundamental flag that we promoted in terms of poverty, in terms of inequality, in terms of insecurity. Look, Costa Rica has been standing poverty. Poverty is low compared to the Latin American mean. It goes from 18 to 20% of people, 5% and sometimes 10%, depending on the circumstances. From 5 to 10% of extreme poverty. What is true is that we came to this percentage 20 years ago, and we have not been able to lower this number. And what I already said, the power of veto of some groups to the decisions promoted by the legislative branch have made it impossible in Costa Rica in the last 15 years to actually approve a fiscal reform in order to guarantee effective redistribution of development. So in light of the difficulties we have had to keep on reducing poverty, we should also speak about redistribution of resources, and we need to also speak about the veto, because there are some decisions that we make and it is impossible to pass those tax reforms. There are two governments, mine, and after political expense, we approved a very ambitious reform, and the constitutional room 2 different times brought this fiscal tax reform because of the lack. It failed because of it took us 18 months after the discussion in Congress. So we've seen how difficult it is to work. So it is not one of the highest poverties in the region, but we do recognize it has been stagnated in the same level for a long time. And last but not least, if we speak about security, I feel pretty proud. This is my area of expertise. I always do public security, and I should tell you that this was the biggest achievement in my term. Homicide rate was 11 for every 100,000, and we were able to come down to for every 100,000, we lowered the most violent crimes, many crimes, violent crimes. We also worked a lot in terms of feminicide. We were able to lower this crime rate, so this is my legacy. And Costa Rica is one of the safest Latin American countries. There is another question. There's only one more question, but I believe it is interesting for the rest of the people, because it is strange. The question was asked by Oscar Donatu from the International Studies Center. He said it is impossible to think about Costa Rica and not think in terms of church. Would it be possible to explain the democratic development despite of the secular confessional condition of your country? Church. Yes, if I am right, if I am not wrong, Costa Rica is in a club. And in this club we have five other countries with this confessional condition in the constitution. And I do believe the key to this is that they didn't hinder each other. They were not in their ways, one and the other, till recently ago, where the mandatory debate that we now see in Costa Rica, as we see in almost all other countries in the world, same gender couples and the recognition of full rights, the issue of marriage between this type of couples, some reproductive health topics. All this is showing evidence of higher confrontation rates between the lay world and the ecclesiastic world. And yes, you are right. In Costa Rica, there are some reforms already submitted to eliminate that article in the Constitution, and it has been addressed even with church. They have accepted and they recognize that it has to necessarily evolve, and in parallel, they've been asking for an agreement to rule the relationship between the Costa Rica state and the Vatican, as we see in most of the states in the world. But as I already told you, in reality, we couldn't say that church, at least in previous terms, we couldn't say there has been an incident on the democratic nature ways. But it seems to be that yes, at this moment, there is a jump in the nature of the confessional state that has characterized the Costa Rican state. There is a question about the media, and it is only one question, but in Mexico it is another topic that we like. How do media operate, and how do media affect? This is a question by Juan Pablo Madrigal from Colegio de Mexico. And in Mexico, this is pretty close to us, and this is something Mexican people are interested. What is the role of the media in your country? Before expressing my feelings, because this is what I am about to do, I would like to also express the following. I would like to express the following reflection, for not to have questions about my perspective of what I've seen recently on this. Costa Rica is a country that has been a believer of freedom of speech in the different indices and that assess freedom of speech and the free exercise of the media, the media freedom in Costa Rica. This is the number one across the region. I am speaking about Reporteros Sin Fronteras. I am speaking about the different NGOs that would assess this type of freedom. We also have laws that have managed to overcome some inconvenient schemes for democracies. For example, the use of criminal law to sanction crimes against the honor Finally, Costa Rica, and I have to say this, and I should say that Costa Rica was alone, but after us, many more governments came, joined us, and I am speaking about this. And there were some other efforts made in solitude as well to reduce some standards that have characterized the inter-American system of human rights, specifically the rapporteur work. In the well-known Bolivia Cochabamba summit 2 years ago, Costa Rica tried to stop some of those efforts by other governments, and a little after that, in Washington, many other nations joined the effort, and those efforts were stopped. I am making reference to this because I believe we have worked correctly, and this should continue. But as in any other type of freedom, there is always a co-responsibility. There is always co-responsibility, because without co-responsibility, then democracy doesn't work. And yes, I do believe that in Costa Rica, as it could happen in some other countries in the region, we have two elements. And there is no full respect of freedom spaces for freedom that we have always given to media. One has to do with excessive concentration of the ownership of those media, and that is not correct. There is no contradiction between or among them. There are only a couple of media that they will impose the publishing or the editorial line, and this is contaminating the information line or the informative line. So I believe this is not convenient. There is a lack of balance, and this is why the media or the press will expose to be destroyed by citizens, because sometimes citizens see how the media or the press is involved in political phenomena against or in favor of a specific government. And the second element is that I believe it is valid. It is valid to ask which are those democratic mechanisms, and I insist on this word, democratic mechanisms that have nothing to do with the political power that allow to control quality in this exercise of journalism. Because journalism that is exposed, let's say, to the influence of the factual powers, economical, criminal, you name it, this is a dysfunctional journalism. So I would say there are some risks in Costa Rica, and it is a debate that I have to recognize. And I also would like to say the following. Speaking about the social media, we need to properly size the social media. But in the career, when people do not want to lose market, in light of the presence of the social media, we start to see how instead of trying to increase the discussion on social media and good press, and then good press started to work being underneath the journalism standards. Many news also have to do with what we see in the social media, and this is why there is no way to properly direct a trend. In the case of mass media, of course, and sometimes there is a relevance that it wouldn't be relevant if we were only speaking about the social media. As you may understand, I tried to order the questions, but there are too many, and we could be here till this afternoon if we were only given the coffee. But my direction is that we need to finish. But I will give the questions to her. There are many questions with an email address, so you may be in touch with them. But here I have a request. Here we have a very specific request, and we want you to make this commitment. It is by Gabriela Valderrama Izquierda. Gabriela Valderrama Izquierdo from the Autonomous University of the State of Morelos. President, when are we going to have a great exhibit by painter Rafael Fernandez in Mexico? And congratulations for your question. When are we going to have this exhibit? Thank you very much. Thanks, Gabriela. We have Rafa is kind of sick, but it is not a limitation for me to convey this to him and to see what we can do. And thanks for your questions and for your interest. And thanks, Federico. We're going to have a short break and then we're going to continue with our next session.